Greetings to all you inflation fighters in the decentralized world. This is Proof of Pod, episode 6. I, as always, am David Medley, and I'm joined by a special guest, Seb Bunney. Hello, Seb.
Oh, man. Thanks for having me on, David. Honestly, I listened to some of your work, and I'm looking forward to chatting.
All right. Seb, you are a full-time Bitcoin educator. Is that?
I would say, you know what, it's tough to label it. We were talking about this kind of before we jumped on, but I always just pursue things that interest me.
Right.
Previously, I've been a mountain bike instructor. I've worked in finance. I've worked in the outdoor industry, and being able to tie together educating and supporting others on their educational journey, no matter the field, ultimately resulted in me teaching about Bitcoin. And so I'm now here teaching about Bitcoin, and I freaking love it. I think this community is incredible. So you could say that I'm a Bitcoin educator. Yeah.
Okay. So most relevant probably to us, you have written a book, The Hidden Cost of Money, and it says you're the co-founder of Looking Glass Education.
That is true. That is true. Yeah, I think when it comes to education and kind of supporting people in an educational journey, I think that when I entered into Bitcoin quite a few years ago, I realized that there is phenomenal resources that dive into the philosophy, whether you're looking at Breedlove, or the technicals, whether you're looking at Antonopoulos. You can talk about corporate Bitcoin from Saylor, but there wasn't enough content that spoke to the layperson, that removed a lot of that jargon. And so to me, what I like to try and do is simplify things down into their simplest form so that the average individual, the working class, are able to understand things. And so that's kind of my passion. So to your point, Looking Glass were founded a handful of years ago with Greg Foss and Dasby and a couple others. And the whole goal was just to break things down for the layperson.
Great. So before we get into the book specifically, I wanted to ask about you and your whole journey, because it sounds very interesting. I have that you were a biking instructor. I have that you were like an investor or trader, eventually coming into the Bitcoin space. Can you just tell me your whole career journey, I guess?
Absolutely. So I would say that if we go all the way back to the start, I've always been really curious, and I've always wanted to kind of question things around me ever since I've been a little kid. And so this has always kind of led me down these rabbit holes. And the first rabbit hole that I think I found, which was my first true love, was kind of mountain biking and sports and just being outside. I didn't want to pursue traditional academia. I wanted to be able to just explore the mountains, because I noticed that when I was in the mountains, it's when I felt myself. It's when I felt attached to nature and the environment around me. And so from there, I started teaching mountain biking. But when I started teaching, I quickly realized that these individuals that as a kid I idolized, you put them on a pedestal, you see them in all these mountain bike movies.
Yeah.
You start to realize these professional individuals, most of them are struggling financially. They're up to their neck in debt. And you name it, they're renting, they don't own their own property. And so I realized very early on that if I wanted to pursue the life that I wanted to live, if I wanted to become a professional athlete, an instructor, I needed to have some other monetary means. I needed to have some other passive income streams. And so in my late teens, I started to look into real estate. And then from there, it kind of evolved into trading in the financial markets, futures, options. And then when you start trading in the financial markets, I naturally started to question our monetary system. It felt like I was under the idea that we had a free market. But all of a sudden, I'm taking these positions, and these positions aren't working out. And they're kept on being more and more monetary intervention, central bank intervention. And so I started to question the system. And that ultimately led me to Bitcoin. But these are kind of like alongside teaching mountain biking and coaching and working in the outdoor industry and you name it. And so there's a bunch of different paths, but they all weave together and have the common thread of I like to question the world and I like to have curiosity.
You look to me like you might still be in your late teens, covered a lot of ground.
I'm only 16. Yeah. I'm only 16. No.
All right. Well, yeah, that's great. I mean, I also have a pretty eclectic career background. It's like I only get this one life. I want to try and experience as many things as I can.
Absolutely. And you know what? I'm very much, and we discussed this very briefly before, where we like to pursue things that interest us. And I think sometimes in hindsight, and actually, you know what? There's a book called, what is it called? Fooled by Randomness by Nassim Taleb. And although a lot of Bitcoiners are not necessarily the biggest fan of Nassim, I think his content is phenomenal. And if you ever read Fooled by Randomness, he talks about the fact that in hindsight, things always look, well, that makes sense. They knew what they're doing all along. But the reality is that many of us are just putting one foot in front of the other, and it opens up these doors. And I think that I've very much in the last kind of handful of years tried not to structure things too much. And I've just pursued things out of interest. If something motivates me, I'm going to dive down that rabbit hole. And it is profound at the doors that it has opened. And so I feel this community as well, a lot of people resonate with that kind of idea. I know a lot of individuals that they just stumbled into this world. And so I think this community is freaking incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, that is actually one book that I've read. I tend to learn less through books than a lot of other things. But yeah, when I read that book, it just really was scratching me where I itch. Mm-hmm. Very good book, I thought. So let's get into the book. How did you decide to write a book? I mean, that's no small undertaking.
To start, I never would have ever expected to write a book. I think I dropped out of English when I was about 12 years old and dropped out of school when I was 14 to pursue mountain biking. English was never my strong point, and I don't think I put a pen to paper in the following kind of decade. And
just out of curiosity, was that New Zealand or Canada or England? Or
so I was born in the UK. My mum is a New Zealander. My dad is a British guy, and then we moved to New Zealand. I was raised in New Zealand, then we moved to Canada. Well, I moved to Canada when I was 14, 15. And so
okay.
I've been over here now for half my life. But yeah, so I kind of going down the education route, I realized that wasn't what I was interested in. Mm-hmm. Outdoors was what I was interested in, teaching, educating. And then when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden I realized, you know what, I love what I'm doing. I was working in the outdoor industry and I was working for a mountain bike manufacturer. We made custom mountain bikes. And I loved it, but it wasn't scratching that itch to kind of what you're mentioning earlier. It wasn't scratching that itch because I felt like, although I'm supporting people in their pursuit of fun, I feel like the world has got some challenges, monetary challenges. And I like to educate and I want to get back into the role of education as opposed to working for a corporation making mountain bikes. So I started to write about our financial world. And to my point earlier, I wanted to speak to the average individual and remove a lot of the jargon. And so I think it was the very start of 2021, I released my first article, which was When More Isn't Better, Inflation in the 21st Century. And it's basically just discussing about why monetary intervention and why inflation are leading to wealth inequality. And from there, it kind of just snowballed. I was truly blown away. I think at the time I had about 7 or 10 followers on Twitter. And Greg Foss ended up resharing the article and then reaching out to a couple of magazines. And I was just in awe. I couldn't believe it. And so from there, I started writing for Bitcoin Magazine and a few other publications. And then it kind of just evolved. I realized that I was starting to form. Initially, I just had these little topics that I wanted to discuss. But then after describing all of these little topics, I realized they all had a common thread. And it was all discussing this idea that money is more than just a medium of exchange. Money weaves its influence into all of these different aspects of our life, whether it's our relationships, whether it's how we show up as individuals, whether it's our environment, our politics, our businesses, you name it. And so from there, I realized that, you know what, there's a book missing. There's a book that, although the whole goal is to orange pill and highlight that we have a solution to the issues we face, people need to understand the problem. And that problem is that our monetary environment is creating all of these downstream issues in the world around us and how we show up. And so ultimately I bumbled along writing, and then I started to realize that I was creating this cohesive narrative and I wanted to put it together in a single thing.
There are two things I want to touch or ask you about there. Actually, I guess one question, one comment maybe. First of all, when you wrote this article, were you paid to do that? Did you just publish on Medium, or how did that come about?
I think my background is I've always liked to support others, and I've always liked to give back to community. And I don't want that to sound like, I'm this selfless individual. I get a lot out of it, trying to help support people in their educational journey. And so to be 100% honest, when I started writing, it was purely just for the idea of trying to share my thoughts. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think up until 2022, 2023, I'd never earned a single dime working in the industry. It was purely just to put myself out there and educate, because I felt that this is a topic that if we can fix our monetary system, or if we can at least help some other individuals move on to something like Bitcoin, then ultimately we're able to support people around us. We're able to help better the lives of certain individuals. And so my goal is really just to be able to share information that others may not be able to have the time or the energy to invest to be able to understand. And it purely just came about from wanting to be able to support others. And so to me, most of my writing, most of the energy that I put into things is not necessarily for monetary gain. It's purely just because I think the world can be a better place if we have a deeper understanding of a monetary system.
Yeah. So just in practical terms, where did you publish this article? Or
the first one, When More Isn't Better, I just put it up on It was either Substack or it was on Medium.
Okay.
It was one of the two, and I can't because I don't use that platform anymore. And from there, I'd shared it, and I think what ended up happening is where I live here in Whistler, BC, in Canada. I have a few friends that also are fascinated by investing. Some of them are fascinated by Bitcoin. And so I think a couple of them read it and shared it with a few of their friends, and it kind of just snowballed from there. And I think at one point, even Alex Gladstein reached out and sent me a direct message complimenting me on the article. And I just remember just being totally enamored because I did not expect it at all. And so that really, really spurred on the fact that, hey, maybe there are people that want to understand the monetary system from that point of the layperson. Because up until that point, I had no idea. I just noticed that at dinner parties, at little gatherings, at hikes, hanging out with friends, people were curious and they would ask me a lot of questions about the monetary system. So I felt like, given that I'm interested in this and I seem to have some understanding, I don't know how complete that understanding is, but I'd like to share my thoughts.
You're saying now, and like the materials that I've seen for your book kind of like present it as a book for the layperson, and that is true. There's a lot to it that I find very thought provoking and kind of, scratches me where I itch also. And one of those is kind of what you were talking about now. Your book introduction is titled "Money is More Than Just a Medium of Exchange," and the subtitle to that is "Why Money is the Ultimate Form of Expression." This is kind of like a piece of kind of like a moral argument that you're making that I find really compelling. I often think of money as like a piece of your life, right? Like if you make $25 an hour and you've got $100 in your hand, that is 4 hours of your life, 4 hours that you spent doing something you didn't necessarily want to do. And I often like challenge people around Black Friday to think about money in that way. It's like if you spend, 4 hours, would you rather have this thing that you don't need and can't afford, or would you rather have 4 hours or whatever of your life to do whatever you want?
No, and you know what? I initially came across this first concept when I listened to Breedlove's, I think it was Michael Saylor series, very early on in his kind of like, well, What is Money podcast. And he discussed this idea of money being a battery that stores our time and energy.
Yeah.
And you can think about it as you expend time and energy and you're remunerated in the form of dollars. And so you can think of those dollars as basically just a battery that's storing your time and energy. But the thing is, if we're going to, let's just say we go to the grocery store, we pick up a bunch of AAA batteries that we want to use throughout the year, whether it's in TV remotes or you name it. And then by the time you actually come around to using that battery's lost 50% of its charge. You're going to be pretty frustrated. But the reality is that is how our money works today.
This was actually happening with like EVs recently. It was in the news. It was very cold here, and the EVs were only getting like 50% of their normal mileage.
Absolutely. And that's where I just think it's frustrating if there's an individual as a blue collar worker, we're going and spending 10 hours of our time to be paid, what, $200-300. But then by the time we go to spend that money, it's only worth $150. And so the challenge that we face is that our current money does not store value effectively. And kind of building on this point, which you kind of brought up at the start about money being this it's more than just a medium of exchange. The way that I tend to like looking at it is that money is kind of the ultimate form of expression. Like language, it's just how we express to the world what it is that we value. And if you just monitor transactions, you just see people exchanging value between one another, you can get an idea about what it is that they value. If I'm going out and buying a new mountain bike, I'm going and buying running shoes, I'm going and buying outdoor gear, or someone else is going and buying a PlayStation, going and buying a TV, you name it, you can see what it is they value by how they spend their money. And so the challenge is when, just like language, money can also be censored. And censorship isn't in the form of just like preventing you from saying what you want to say. What it does is it can be a lot more obscure. You can have things like inflation. If over time our money is worth less, then ultimately we're not able to express ourselves to the same extent that we once were able to. Or you can have things like capital controls, like in China, where it's very hard for them to be able to invest their money overseas. So ultimately that means they're stuck within China. And if China wants to devalue their currency, which they do, then you just have to deal with it. You have to bite it. And so the challenge is, whether it's capital controls, whether it's restrictions on what we can purchase, whether it's inflation, these are all forms of monetary censorship, which are impeding our ability to express ourselves how we would like to. And that ultimately distorts society because we don't actually see what people value. And
Yes.
the analogy actually on the What Bitcoin Did podcast, I gave kind of an analogy, which is if I as an individual do not support war, if I do not like war, and so I actively want to make sure that I'm not going to spend my money towards any companies that support war, well,
Yes.
it doesn't matter if you've got a government who's going to run deficits and fund war through monetary debasement, because ultimately my purchasing power through debasement, through the loss of my purchasing power, is going towards funding war. So now my expression is being shown in the form of funding war. So it's ultimately we're impeded in our ability to be able to understand what it is that society values when we have a government who can devalue the currency and spend money where they see fit.
Yeah, actually, that's I was going to bring that up because I really like that part of the interview. It's let's just say like whether through taxes or inflation, you're a peaceful person, and the government is taking away from you 4 hours of your productive life, or like hundreds of hours probably, and spending that on war when you would like to take your productive life and spend it on peace. It's taken away your expression.
Absolutely.
When I was researching you a little bit, thinking about this interview, I was starting to think of kind of three broad arguments for Bitcoin and maybe other cryptocurrencies in a way that I maybe hadn't quite thought of it before. So one is like technological, like it works, it solves a problem we couldn't solve before, it creates decentralized internet money, right? The second broad argument is kind of like profit. Like if you buy it now, it'll be worth more later. These are very broad categories. But the third really broad category would be kind of like a moral argument. And I think that we are missing out on this as like our community. We are focused more on the practicals of it, the technology, and like payment systems and all this kind of stuff. We're focused on number go up, like get your money in it now. And we don't talk enough about the moral argument for Bitcoin. And I was thinking, like, when I try to talk to somebody, I try to convince some no coiner to get on the Bitcoin train. I'm not doing it for those first two reasons. I'm doing it because I believe Bitcoin is moral. I think that the current system is unfair. Purchasing power of everyone who accepts fiat for their labor or products is partially stolen by central banks and their cronies. And Bitcoin is like the best solution we have for that problem right now. And so I've really shifted my thinking about my way of talking to people about it. I still talk about the other points, but I've shifted to talking a lot more about the morality of Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, and I think it's interesting because what we are increasingly seeing with an interventionistic system is that our system is breaking down a lot of our morals. And I think that there's a phenomenal quote that I mentioned in the book by a guy named Ross Stevens, who's the founder of kind of Stonebridge Asset Management. And he says, Bitcoin is a system built upon rules instead of rulers. And I love this quote because it's arguably one of my favorite quotes, just because I think that it really highlights that our current system is very much built upon rulers. It is built upon individuals that we have to trust that they have our best interests at heart. Not only do we have to trust that the government has our best interests at heart, we have to trust that the central bankers have our best interests at heart, that the banks have our best interests at heart. There's so much trust involved. And ultimately, I think that we are being taken advantage of on so many different levels, whether it is artificial interest rates, whether it is monetary intervention, whether it is government controls, policy, deficit spending, you name it, that are all impacting us as individuals. And it also creates a very hierarchical system. And people have probably heard of the Cantillon effect. And for those that aren't familiar, it's basically those closest to the monetary spigot benefit disproportionately. And what I mean by that is those closest to the monetary printer benefit above and beyond the average individual. Given that they're the ones who obtain new money first, they can spend it into the economy, and then it has all the repercussions, inflation, debasement, you name it. And so I think kind of back to that point about morals, what I love about Bitcoin is it puts every single person, no matter who you are, whether you're Joe Biden or you're some guy on the streets in India, you're all playing by the same rules. And I think that that is profound because it flips all of the incentives, because ultimately what ends up happening is it incentivizes value creation. If you can no longer devalue the currency at the expense of someone else, if you can no longer seize large swaths of money through middlemen and third parties, if you can no longer just take things by force to the same extent that we can in our current system, the only way to obtain something is to actually offer value. And so ultimately, we have a system where it forces a free market, a system that actually forces value to rise to the top. And I think there are so many incredible benefits from such a system.
Yeah, 100%. Thinking pretty hard about Bitcoin a lot for like 10 years. Okay. And something that's really amazing me, it's continuing to amaze me this day, is that like everybody thinks they know what money is. But once we start to really examine it, we find that it's very counterintuitive. Mm-hmm. And your whole book seems to almost be like, let's look at money with new eyes.
No, I definitely, and that was my intention. Like, I think, as I mentioned at the very start, I don't think people understand to what extent money weaves its influence into all of these different aspects of our lives.
Yeah.
And one of the ones that or one of the areas I like to discuss is even just behavior. I don't think people realize just to what extent money impacts our behavior. And to give you just a couple of different examples, like the first one, in Bitcoin, and Bitcoiners are probably familiar with this, there's something called time preference. And time preference is, do I have a low time preference where I'm thinking about the future? I'm thinking about building security. Or do I have a high time preference? I'm being very impulsive. I'm meeting my immediate needs at the expense of the future. And so ultimately, when our money in the fiat world is losing value from one day to the next, we're actually incentivized to spend, given that our money is worth its most in the present moment. And so that's incentivizing a very impulsive, short-term thinking mindset, a high time preference, and vice versa. When we have something like Bitcoin with a fixed supply, as we see more demand, as we see more adoption, as productivity and efficiency increases, prices fall in relation to Bitcoin, which means if our purchasing power is increasing, then life starts to get easier. We're incentivized to think longer term. We're incentivized to think about the future and building security. So ultimately, our money is now changing. Are we thinking about the future? Or are we thinking about our impulsive behavior and our needs right now? And then the second one that I kind of tend to like talking about is just like meaninglessness and apathy. In our current environment, the challenge that we face is that our money is worth less over time. Because of that, house prices are rising, cost of living is rising. It's becoming harder and harder and harder to get ahead. And ultimately, what that means is it's very hard for the average individual to plan, to think about the future. And so people are they're now just, again, going back to that first point, they're living very impulsively. They're just trying to do whatever they can to simply survive. And so if you're unable to plan, if you're unable to purchase a house, if you're unable to put a roof over your family's heads, meaninglessness can quickly set in. And we're seeing higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of suicide, drug use, you name it, all because they're losing hope. And then the final point that I want to quickly touch on is even just like compassion and altruism. Within the world of kind of psychology, there's something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's kind of a 5-tier pyramid with our base the base of the pyramid being we need food and security to be able to move up the pyramid. Without food and security, like shelter, there is no way we can start thinking about relationships, self-actualization, spirituality, you name it, because you've got to meet those basic needs. And the challenge is when our environment is becoming more and more hostile, when it's getting harder and harder to live, we're getting stuck on the base of this pyramid, which means we're having less capacity to give back to society, less capacity to look inwards and ask, how do I want to show up in the world? How do I want to give back? And so ultimately, I think that the fiat world is incentivizing extraction. It's incentivizing artificial competition where people are just trying to get whatever they can to be able to survive. It's not incentivizing value creation, collaboration, you name it.
Totally agree. Related, but not quite exactly what you're talking about. In high school, like this is kind of what I thought, kind of what was being taught, that inflation hurts the rich by devaluing their savings. But I think that most of us Bitcoiners now realize that that's not the case. And you pointed out that wages actually lag inflation, and so like the average person is the one who's being hurt by inflation, not the person with a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. No, and a lot of people struggle to sometimes understand how inflation actually ends up creating wealth inequality. And ultimately, in its most simplistic view, given that the majority of people that hold capital are actually the lower middle class, while the upper class tend to hold more assets, what ends up happening is as our money loses value over time, you're no longer incentivized to save in the currency. So people with capital, they go and invest in assets. So we see all of these assets being sucked up by wealthy individuals. While at the same time, you see the lower class, the middle class going in consumption. They go and spend things on food, holidays, you name it, or even just to basically be able to survive. And so over time, you see this wealth inequality where our purchasing power is slowly declining. The lower middle class are feeling the effects of that, cost of living rising, house prices becoming like inescapable effectively. And then you're also seeing wealth inequality rise because all of the assets are being sucked up, but they're going up in price. They're appreciating in value. And that appreciation is not necessarily because of demand. That appreciation is because our currency is losing purchasing power, which can be confusing.
Yeah. I mean, it's actually known in economics that labor is, I don't know if it's inelastic is the right term. It's slow to move. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, like it's known that like you print a bunch of money, like labor costs don't go up as fast as, first of all, stock prices and other asset prices, real estate and so on. So, I mean, like it's known, that like inflation is going to hurt labor, but they don't care, I guess. Who knows?
Well, and it's tough because naturally businesses want to be able to survive. They want to maximize profit. That's the whole goal of a business. And so the challenge is that they're not going to, out of the blue, just go and constantly raise wages at the point at which they're going to start to impact themselves. So naturally, what we start to see is inflation causes prices to rise over time. And then we see the response from companies after the fact. It's a reactive response to raise wages because naturally people start demanding it. Their cost of living is rising to the point where they can no longer support themselves and their families. So we need a price rise. And it's interesting. When was it? A year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I was working in the school district. And while I was working in the school district, we had this guy come around who was kind of the head of the school district. And he ultimately said, you guys have been working so hard this year. I'm going to reward you guys with a 4% pay rise. And at the time, everyone started cheering. And I kind of put up my hand and I was just like, I want to ask a quick question. Do you guys know that we just had inflation this year of 7%? So if we're having a 4% pay rise, actually what we're having is a 3% pay cut. Yeah. We've still lost 3% of our purchasing power from the previous year. And the manager was.
So did you actually say this out loud?
I said this out loud. And I said this out loud in front of a bunch of different teachers and they all started cheering because I don't think people quite understand to what extent they're being impacted. And their wages seem to be going up, but life seems to be getting harder. And I think a lot of this stuff, we just really need to bring it out of the shadows and into the forefront of our minds and understand, how does money actually impact us? Why does life seem to be getting harder? And a lot of it stems from a broken monetary system with more and more intervention. And as there's more and more intervention, more and more capital goes towards paying down debt, more and more capital floods into assets to escape debasement, asset prices get more expensive, inflation, you name it.
So what do you make of the argument, like, we have to like stop borrowing, go into austerity, and it's going to hurt for a while, but it'll be better in the long run?
So it's a challenging one because a lot of people, when they talk about Bitcoin, and I'll slightly pivot your question a little bit. A lot of people, when we talk about Bitcoin, they always say, well, we can never go to a deflationary system because ultimately it's going to collapse the economy, and that's bad for the economy. And to me, that's kind of like saying to the heroin addict, well, I can never stop heroin because there's a potential for withdrawals. And the reality is that, yeah, but heroin is freaking killing you. And the reality is that when we have an inflationary system, a debt-based system that requires greater and greater and greater intervention, ultimately, this is at the expense of the general populace. It's the expense of us as individuals, working class individuals, because our cost of living becomes unbearable. It's impacting our relationships, impacting the health of the planet through consumption, you name it. So all of these things, when the government constantly intervenes more and more and more, the challenge is, as we intervene more, the benefit of that intervention is becoming less and less and less. And there's an interesting chart in the book where I look at basically this chart of, for every $1 of debt taken on, what percentage of that goes towards GDP? And I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I remember them vaguely. And it's something like, in the US, for every $1 of debt taken on, 10 years ago, 42 cents of GDP would be created.
Okay.
Whereas now, 10 years later, it's only something like 30 cents of GDP. So we've already seen a 25% drop off in the productivity of debt. And so the more we pull this lever and intervene and intervene and intervene, eventually that intervention doesn't actually do anything for the economy. It only creates a greater and greater burden. And so the challenge that we face is, yes, we can keep going down this path of intervention, but it's creating all of these byproducts, these whack-a-moles that we can keep trying to hit with more and more intervention, but the economy eventually collapses. We go into hyperinflation, and we're seeing this in countries like Venezuela. We're seeing this in countries like Argentina. And eventually, the general populace are just kind of like, wait, we have this socialist interventionist environment, this left-leaning government, but I'm not feeling like life is getting any easier.
Yeah.
And so I urge us as a community, we need to realize that we have to go through some form of austerity, living within our means, because we've been borrowing from the future. We've been living beyond our means for so freaking long. And so it's impossible to transition to a new system without basically honing in and reining in our intervention, because we've been stealing from the future. When we borrow, we're borrowing from our kids and our grandkids and so on.
Yeah. So I believe that this argument that we need some short-term pain to help us out in the future, and I've heard this argument a lot, and it made a lot of sense to me for a long time. And I recently heard it, from like Ron Paul, one of the greatest humans of my lifetime, right? I think it's wrong, and I think it's making us lose the debate. Okay.
I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Certainly, you can envision like a very fast reduction, which could cause a lot of disruption and maybe would cause some short term pain. But to like make it kind of a fair race or whatever, you could envision like a slow but steady decrease, which would not cause more pain. I think it would be instant benefits, right? The tax revenue is being taken out of the economy, right? That can't be spent on more productive things. Debt is being borrowed out of the economy or printed, out of the economy, so to speak. Like these are the pain points. These are the things that are causing us problems. If we reduce the amount of printing, if we reduce the amount of debt, we reduce the amount of taxes taken out, even reduce the amount of government spending and all that kind of stuff, I really believe it's going to be like an instant benefit and not some kind of like transitionary period where we have to suffer. And I believe that, and I think that we've kind of ceded this ground to the statists, if you will, like, oh yeah, like your way works best in the short term. And I think that's wrong. I think our way works best in the short term.
You know what? I would agree to a certain extent. The challenge which I struggle, or where I struggle, is that our current system has incentivized a lot of debt consumption. And whether that's through artificial interest rates or favorable financing, intervention, stimulus checks, you name it. So I think that the average individual they've got cars on lease. A lot of the time they put 5% down on a mortgage. So they've now got a house. So they can sometimes be living quite comfortably, but all of this stuff is on basically borrowed money. And the reality is, and then not only that, but you can also think about corporations. Like 40% of the Russell 2000, which is 2,000 of the small cap companies in the US, 40% of them are zombie companies, which effectively means that they are not making enough money to even cover the debt service payments on their debt. And so what you start to realize is that if we were to cut intervention all of a sudden, we could see a large swath of US companies go under. We could also see a large swath of individuals who could no longer afford their payments on their mortgages, on their cars, you name it. And so this is where I do think Jeff Booth talks about this, where we need a slow transition to be able to support people and slowly raise awareness to this thing that is Bitcoin, so we can build the bridge wider and wider and wider. Because at the moment, it's a very small bridge. There's only a handful of million people globally using Bitcoin. We need to be getting billions of people on Bitcoin. And so I think, to your point, absolutely. And I think the long-term benefits are just immeasurable. I think there's so many incredible benefits, such as the fact that the challenge we face today is because we're able to borrow beyond our means, we have such a huge debt burden. And I'll give you an example. Like Canada has 420% debt to GDP. And so again, for those who are not familiar, GDP, you can just think of it as gross domestic product. It's all of the monetary transactions within Canada within a given year. And so,
by the way, I hate debt to GDP. I think it should always be debt to tax revenue, but go ahead.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so when you're looking at debt to GDP just as like a rough mathematical formula,
that's
what you start to
standard
realize is that's the standard. And you realize it's 4.2 times more debt than GDP or monetary transactions. And all of that debt we're talking about corporate debt, household debt, government debt, all of that debt has an interest rate because you're borrowing. And if we put a conservative interest rate of 3%, so multiply 3 by 4.2 times the 420% debt, you have 12.6%. That basically means that GDP has to grow by 12.6% just to be able to pay down debt. But the reality is that GDP in Canada over the last 100 years has annualized like 0.61% or something like that. So we're well short of being able to even just meet our service payments. And so I think that's where, in a world with Bitcoin, what ends up happening is we prevent all of this capital expenditure going towards debt service payments because it makes debt unfavorable. And not only that, but we're seeing so much basically unproductive capital going towards servicing these zombie companies, these thousands of companies across the US and across Canada, across the world, that aren't actually offering value. They're being propped up by debt. So I think that in the long term, it creates and stimulates value creation. It supports productivity and efficiency, which ultimately ends up benefiting us, the individual, the consumer, the average individual.
Yeah, obviously, I completely agree with you. But just to make my point one more time, I believe that when you use the example of the family, like they're borrowing from somebody else. When you use the example of Canada, they're borrowing from themselves in effect, right? So when they take $1 billion, let's say, and spend it on some BS program, well, that $1 billion is coming from somewhere else, right? So I really believe that if they didn't use that $1 billion as stimulus, that $1 billion would be free up somewhere else, and I think that you'd actually have immediate benefit for them not stimulating. But
no, and I fully agree with that point. I fully agree with that point. I think that we will just see in the short term a wipe through of fiscal irresponsibility.
Yeah.
Given that intervention can no longer happen.
It's amazing. It is amazing. So the reader level of your book is what, like a high school graduate kind of thing or higher?
You know what? It's a tough one. I would say that if you're a curious individual, then I would definitely recommend anyone giving it a go. I've had kind of mid to late teenagers read the book, but anyone, whether they are interested in finance or not, I've tried to give a baseline understanding of everything that I discuss. So I'm not going to just dive into quantitative easing and start using these terms. If I have to discuss something that is jargon, I will explain that jargon beforehand so that people understand that. And so what I've really been super humbled by when it comes to the book is that I've had a lot of partners reach out saying, hey, my husband is super interested in Bitcoin and finance. I've never really been interested in it. But the moment you start bringing the family unit into the question, you talk about kids and how money is impacting kids, now I'm intrigued. And so I've been so blown away by the response for people that aren't actually that interested in finance and Bitcoin, but their partner is. And now this has kind of supported them down the rabbit hole. And that has just been, I've been blown away.
Yeah, it's definitely intended to be a very entry-level book. But again, I know that a lot of people who are not entry level will get a lot out of it as well, because you really, I think, are kind of tackling an element of the Bitcoin narrative that isn't tackled enough. And that's partly moral, but also partly just kind of like real life and like, relationships and, all those kinds of things.
Absolutely. And you know what? One of the things I was very conscious about when I wrote the book is I realized that when it comes to Bitcoin, as Bitcoiners, we're incredibly passionate. We want to be able to try and foresee the world as a better place. We want to believe the future is bright. And so we want to push Bitcoin at every single moment we can. But the challenge with that is that many people, they've been pushed by the media, they've been swayed by the media to believe that Bitcoin is this Ponzi scheme. Bitcoin is this thing that boils the oceans. Bitcoin is volatile. Bitcoin is, you name it, all of the other arguments. And so the moment you bring up Bitcoin, people, if they don't understand the problem, are immediately going to put up the walls. There's going to be aversion to Bitcoin. So one of the things I was very conscious of when I wrote the book is to actually first identify the pain points of the individual. So I tried to touch on what are the key pain points that most people are feeling in society today. We're feeling rising prices. We're feeling a breakdown in relationships. We can't show up authentically. You name it. And then after I've kind of identified the pain points, we then dive into the problem. Well, why are these things happening? Was because our monetary system is leading to all of these kind of byproducts, which are impacting us, the individual. And then only after we actually understand the pain points and the problem, can we then offer up a solution. And even then, I try not to dive straight into Bitcoin. I actually try to backwards engineer Bitcoin and ask the questions, well, what would a monetary system look like to be able to realign the incentives in society, to realign collaboration and value creation and supporting one another? And then I dive into Bitcoin as a potential solution. So I really was trying to be conscious for the average individual that if you're not already down the rabbit hole, I don't want this to feel like you're just reading a friggin' Bitcoin biopsy.
Very good. What is your feeling on altcoins?
I would say that a lot of people use the term shitcoin. I don't tend to use the term shitcoin. The reason why is just because you just need to look at, say, the 2000 tech boom to realize that, yes, 99% of the companies that came out during the 2000 tech boom and blew up just because they had a website, or in the instance of crypto, they just put the name blockchain on their website. They kind of went under. Most of them were scams, you name it. The reality is that you can never say for certain that nothing is going to come out of the altcoin space. For me personally, I do not invest in altcoins. I invest in just Bitcoin because I believe that if we can fix the monetary system, I believe we can fix many of the challenges and start to resolve a lot of the challenges we face in society. So my energy is 100% focused on Bitcoin. I think that there are a lot of altcoins out there that are just pure scams. There's some that people do have great intentions for, but the majority of them are going to go to zero. And so I think for people getting into the space, there's going to be a lot of shiny rocks over there that can distract us. And most of the individuals that I interact with that are deep down the Bitcoin rabbit hole have started off in the crypto space, and myself included. I tinkered with it, but I quickly realized that actually Bitcoin is quite a superior asset. And if we fix the money, we can fix a lot of the issues we face. And so ultimately, they and myself have found my way back to Bitcoin. Okay. But you know what? I'm not gonna tell people to not do things, because curiosity is important.
All right, let me give you Medley's test of Bitcoin maximalism. Okay, your eccentric uncle or whatever passes away, and he's going to give you $100,000 of Bitcoin, and you have to hold it for 10 years, and then you can do whatever you want with it. Or you can have X $100,000 of like an altcoin ETF. What does X have to be for you to choose that over Bitcoin?
Well, am I allowed to sell the X ETF and go straight into Bitcoin?
No, it's always the 10-year. I probably missed to say that. Yeah, it's always, you have to hold it for 10 years.
Yeah.
And if you say, if your number is 100, that means you're ambivalent. You don't really care between Bitcoin and a altcoin ETF. Anything more than 100 means that you are on the maximalist side, and anything less than 100 means that you're on the altcoin side.
I would say that ultimately the whole purpose of money is to be able to store value, to be able to materially change the life around us. And so for me to be able to even just sell my Bitcoin that I have at the moment, it would be to go and purchase a house with no debt, so that I knew that I could have security to be able to pursue whatever it is that I wanted, whether that is educating about Bitcoin, whether that is mountain biking, whether it's running, you name it. And so the way that I look at this is I'm the most confident that Bitcoin is going to be the best performing asset over the next kind of 10 to 15 years.
Yeah.
I have very little confidence in any of the other altcoins. And so I would never actually go and invest in those things. That said, if you were to give me enough altcoins to be able to sell it immediately to go and buy a house with no mortgage of my choosing, I would probably pick that, simply because it gives me security to be able to pursue these other things, such as educating in Bitcoin, building companies around Bitcoin, so earning Bitcoin in other means without going and buying Bitcoin directly. So that's how I'd think about it. I would think about it in terms of, ultimately my goal is Bitcoin, and I want to educate on Bitcoin and support the Bitcoin network. But at the same time, I still have a primary goal of, how do I create security to be able to educate effectively? Because if I'm broke and if Bitcoin goes to zero, then I'm not an effective Bitcoin educator.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I see things.
I'm looking for a number.
A number?
Yeah, well, you got to hold it for 10 years.
The average house in the Sea to Sky, which is where I live in Canada, the average house is around $2.5 to $3.5 million. So I would need $2.5 to $3.5 million in this ETF to be able to sell it immediately.
No, you can't sell it immediately. You cannot sell either of them immediately.
You cannot sell either of them.
You have to hold for 10 years.
10 years?
Yes.
Well, then Bitcoin.
What if I offered you 10 times, like $1 million of altcoins versus $100,000 of Bitcoin?
No.
What if I offered you $1 billion of altcoins versus $100,000 of Bitcoin?
No, because I've seen so many of these things just lose 99.5% of their value.
What if I offered you $1 trillion of altcoins versus $100,000 of Bitcoin?
Well, if you're offering me $1 trillion, then it sounds like I'm the only holder of this currency, and this thing's going to zero anyway when I try and sell it.
Well, it's all the altcoins, Ethereum, and on down.
Yeah, it's what I'm just trying to think. If it was if you offered me $1 trillion of an ETF that was distributed amongst all of the altcoins,
yeah,
then I would probably take that, simply just because probabilistically I can never say for certain that every single one 100% are going to go to zero, and all you need is one to perform, and you've done probably pretty well. If it was $1 trillion, but I wouldn't do it for 100,000, the same as Bitcoin. I wouldn't do it for a freaking million. I wouldn't do it for quite a bit more than that, because I do believe that 99.9% of them are going to go to zero.
What about $1 trillion? What about 100 billion? So it's 1,000 times more of altcoins than Bitcoin, but you have to hold for 10 years.
I think probabilistically there's going to be one that is going to outperform Bitcoin in a 10-year period, potentially. But I think in the long term that it won't.
All right. How about 100 times? I'll give you 100 times.
No.
Okay. So we're somewhere around 1,000.
Between 100 billion and $1 trillion. There we go.
So let's see, 1,000 times. So your score on the test, I think, is 100,000 then. I think you're the fifth person to take it. You're the highest score so far.
Really?
Yeah.
A Bitcoin maximalist. And you know what? I've I've pondered writing an article about this before about Bitcoin maximalism, and I think that what's challenging about Bitcoin maximalism is the fact that ultimately we don't know what the future holds. My energy is 110% dedicated to Bitcoin. But at the same time, I wouldn't like to think that I am like religious zealot and I'm not able to see the world as it really is. So if in the future, in 10 years' time, something were to happen to Bitcoin, there was a code change and there was actually some better coin, I would like to think that whatever that better coin is, subjectively or whatever, objectively, I would have the foresight to be able to recognize that, because ultimately it's not about Bitcoin. It's about how do we create a world that's actually better for us, the individual? How do we create a world that supports families, supports individuals? And so that's kind of how I view things. And I think the best bet to be able to change the world around us is Bitcoin. And I think what's really challenging about a lot of maximalists, especially toxic maximalists, is we slam and attack other people that have different views. And it's totally fine to have other views. And when it comes to the altcoin space, I think when we slam other people for views they hold, it's kind of like parenting from the 50s. It's getting out the belt and whipping our child because they have an interest in something, where ultimately I think that we can mention our own beliefs and try to kind of maybe guide them over to something like Bitcoin because we may see something they don't see, but it's still ultimately their decision. And I think curiosity is important. As long as people are curious, that's all I care about.
Yeah. Everything you said along those lines, I agree with. My score on the maximalism test is about 200. So I guess I'm a bit more optimistic about the pantheon of altcoins than you are.
Yeah.
Another question. This is something that I kind of like challenging the Bitcoin community on in a way. You were saying that well, there's all these functions of money, right? And this was, maybe just kind of off the cuff remark, but you were saying that you feel like all currencies have to have store of value kind of as their central component, or maybe I'm misquoting you. Or
I think that when it comes to money, for those who are not familiar, you've got kind of store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account. These are kind of like the three core aspects or functions of money. So store of value obviously has to store value. Medium of exchange, it has to be able to be exchangeable between things so you can actually transact effectively. And unit of account, if it works well as a unit of measure. So we currently, here in Canada, we use the Canadian dollar. When you go into a grocery store, prices are going to be priced in Canadian dollars. In the US, it's going to be the US dollar. When it comes to Bitcoin, and actually, to be honest, I think any money, ultimately, one of the challenges that we currently face in society is the fact that our money doesn't serve as a store of value. And because it doesn't serve as a store of value, the challenge we face is that people look to store value elsewhere. So what do? They go and invest in things like real estate. They go and invest in things like equities. They go and invest in farmland. They go and invest in bonds. So all of a sudden, these other things like real estate become monetary assets. They're not used for their utility being to put a roof over people's heads. So increasingly what we're finding is that people are struggling to be able to get by. They can't afford houses. Rent is going up because people are seeking to store value in houses. Where I live in Whistler, 61% of houses are empty. There's tens of thousands of houses empty in London. And you start to realize that it's simply because investors are looking to store capital out of the currency because it doesn't act as a store of value. So what I believe is that we need a monetary system whereby the money acts as a store of value so it doesn't misalign the incentives. It doesn't have money flooding into other assets and taking the utility of that asset off the market. And we're seeing it with farmland. Billionaires, millionaires are buying up farmland left, right, and center, not to use it to farm goods, not to use it to raise cattle, but instead to use it to simply store value because land is somewhat scarce. And we're removing that utility from the general populace. And so I think that money at its base function needs to be able to store value, or else it creates all these misaligned incentives.
For sure. And like just our whole retirement system, whatever, it's like you have an IRA or whatever, you can't hold it in cash. It's insane, and very upsetting for sure. So kind of like where I feel like I look at it a little bit differently from a lot of the community is, and especially when we first started coming around, we had these ideas of oh, you're going to walk into a coffee shop in Bombay and you're going to buy a coffee with Bitcoin. And that's the future that we're building towards. And, I realized after a few years, no, especially here in the United States, I don't have to buy a coffee with Bitcoin. I have credit cards and dollar bills and all that kind of stuff. I think that Bitcoin doesn't, or any cryptocurrency, doesn't have to fulfill all the uses of money in order for it to be very useful, right? The current system seems to be falling down mostly, like you're saying, in this store of value thing. So hey, like let's have Bitcoin kind of move in on that store of value concept, and to the extent that it can fulfill the other purposes of money, so much the better. But it doesn't have to fulfill all of them to be good at one of those things. Like if you look at like the bond market, like the bond market is enormous. And that's kind of like, you know, the store of value market, if you will, in the fiat world.
I would push back a little bit, and that I'd say there's something called Gresham's law, and Gresham's law is that bad money drives out good.
Yes.
And so in this situation, naturally, because we have legal tender laws whereby people have to accept US dollars, they have to accept Canadian dollars, they have to accept the euro.
Yes.
What that means is that companies, small businesses, you name it, have to accept the legal tender in that jurisdiction.
Yes.
And that means that as customers, we give away the worst money and we keep the good money, such as Bitcoin or gold or whatever money we deem as the best. And so in a situation where there are legal tender laws, we always trend towards poorer and poorer and poorer money, being that fiat is legal tender. These corporations, these entities have to accept fiat. But the reality is that I think that if we had a free market, if we had one where we remove legal tender laws, in time, we would trend towards the one that actually offers the best store of value. And the reason why I say that is because if you're a company, why would you want to save in an inferior asset? And so I think that in time, we would start to see people having to spend Bitcoin, because if I'm a company, I don't want to receive dollars. I don't want to receive this thing that's losing purchasing power over time. I want to receive Bitcoin, and I want to try and minimize any expenses to be able to transition into Bitcoin. And I think that we are already starting to see, I very much sat in your field of view for a long time. And then I went to Honduras, and then I went to Madeira, and then I went to Nicaragua, and I started to actually interact with Lightning. I started to actually buy things with Lightning, and you realize how freaking powerful it is, how quick it is. And these small businesses, many of them, they don't trust in the US, in Canada, and a lot of these Western nations, we can trust that our bank is not going to steal from us. Our bank is not going to charge us obscene fees. But in a lot of these developed countries, developing countries, they're freaking struggling. Their banks close down all the time. Their banks take their customers' money. They've got insane fees. And so it becomes very hard for those individuals to trust their bank. And so many times having to hold cash, but then cash is prone to inflation and all of these other issues. So I think that when it comes to Bitcoin, more and more in a free market situation, people are going to start demanding the stronger money. That's kind of how I view it. But I do agree. If we've got legal tender laws, I think that Bitcoin is primarily going to be used as a store of value. Moreover, until Bitcoin is treated as currency, whereby we no longer have capital gains tax on it, we're not actually incentivized to even use Bitcoin for day-to-day transactions. Because if you purchase Bitcoin at freaking $30,000 and now it's trading at $70,000 and you want to go and buy that coffee for $5, well, it's not just $5 because you also got to pay capital gains tax on the fact that you've had 120% gain. So I think that people don't think about that either, that in a system where Bitcoin is treated as property, where there's capital gains tax, we're not incentivized to spend it.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of what you're saying. So I don't have experience with, the nations that you're talking about, but I understand that, like, they're facing whole different levels of struggle than I am, going to a Starbucks or whatever. One thing about Gresham's law is that the bad currency drives the good currency out of circulation, but it drives the good currency into savings. It doesn't drive out Bitcoin like we don't need Bitcoin. It instead drives Bitcoin into a savings role.
No, you make a really good point. And I think that is important to note, because Bitcoin can still be offer immense utility, even in a world where the majority of nations outlaw it as a medium of exchange, unit of account. It can still be phenomenal, just as a savings vehicle, just as day-to-day smaller little interactions with people outside of the system. I think that's where Bitcoin really shines, is it supports the individual.
Yeah. And when I can go into a coffee shop and easily buy my coffee, I don't even drink coffee, but
I don't drink coffee either.
with Lightning or whatever, I'm going to welcome that for sure. But I just think that we can get too focused on that. Like, oh, what good is Bitcoin? What good is Lightning? I just go into a coffee shop and I pay with a credit card, I pay with dollars or whatever. Uh, I don't think we need to argue against that. I think we can just say,
Mhm.
yeah, you're right. Like it's easier in the United States where I live to buy your coffee with fiat, and that's fine.
Mhm.
Um, but nevertheless, like Bitcoin is doing something that the dollar is not, and it's very important to recognize that and try and profit from that, if you will.
Mhm. Nope, I fully agree.
I knew that we'd mostly agree. I was also thinking when I was thinking about this about poker chips because I play a lot of poker, right?
Mhm.
So you go to the casino and you let's say give $1,000 at the cage and you get poker chips, right? And you go to the table and you play with the poker chips. Those poker chips are acting as a form of money, right? And they're very similar to, let's say, U.S. dollars in this case. I have three differences that I could think of. One is that the poker chips are actually a better medium of exchange for the purpose at hand, which is playing poker. And then like there's some small counterparty risk, like maybe the poker room will go out of business, before you can get your money back. And there's some small friction, like buying the poker chips and then cashing them out at the end. Um, but for me, like who plays a lot of poker, this kind of like is a little bit illustrative of kind of like how different monies can operate. These poker chips are less valuable, like if you step outside the casino, obviously, but they are more useful at the poker table.
Mhm.
So the bad money of the poker chips is kind of driving out the good money of the dollar bills because it's easier to work with.
No, I think that's a good analogy. And you know what I find is so fascinating about Bitcoin, and a lot of people skip over this, which is the fact that up until basically Bitcoin, we never had the way to do a peer-to-peer transaction outside of cash. But the
Yes.
challenge with obviously cash is the fact that you have to be physically there in person. And so that creates all its own hurdles. You can't purchase stuff unless you're
Yes.
physically there in person. You can't send money globally. You can't send money cross borders, you name it. And so I think that one of the most phenomenal
Yeah.
benefits of Bitcoin that is many times kind of not necessarily discussed simply because I think people just assume that it's just knowledge is the fact that Bitcoin is effectively a digital cash transaction. It is
Mm-hmm.
between
Mm-hmm.
I can be here, you can be in the States, I can send you money, and there's no intermediaries, no middlemen, just as if
Yeah.
we had met in person. And that is, I find, truly, truly profound about Bitcoin.
Yeah. There's like a give and take. For instance, like you can't charge back with Bitcoin, right?
Mhm.
Is that good? Is that bad? Well, it's both, right? In some ways, it can be good. Like if there's an exchange of goods and like the exchange was not, completed, and you can say, hey, intermediary, like, give me back my money. Like you're very happy that you can charge back in that circumstance, or if somebody steals your credit card, identity theft or whatever. Like I've had this happen before, and it's wonderful. You
Mhm.
just like say, hey, I didn't do this credit card company, and they're like, okay, here's your money back.
Mhm. Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I think you make such a good point, which is that ultimately, I think sometimes when it comes to Bitcoin, we can kind of believe we have this panacea, this like
Yes,
perfect
yes.
world. And the reality is, I don't think there's no perfect solution. There's only trade-offs. Every single
Yeah, yeah.
system has disadvantages, and it's got immense benefits. And I think when it comes to Bitcoin, to your point, I've had identity theft. I've had times where I've been able to just hit pause on a transaction that I have
Yeah.
not committed. And then you see other times where I don't know if people saw when was it? Someone must have fat fingered one of the mining fees,
Uh-huh.
one of the transaction fees, and they
Yeah,
freaking
yeah, yeah.
send 20 Bitcoin. And
Yeah.
so
And the miner gave it back,
ultimately,
right?
and the miner gave it back, but
Uh,
he didn't have to give it back. He didn't
yeah.
have to give it back. And 20 Bitcoin is a decent chunk of money that
Yeah.
someone has just accidentally fat fingered to give to a miner.
Awesome. I had another question, kind of unrelated, but I wanted to ask if somebody reads your book and then they really like it and they want to read more, do you have any recommendation for a follow up to your book?
Initially, this is actually my second book. The first book I co-wrote with my business partner Daz, and so that book is called Beers for Bitcoin. And so
Okay.
for people that have gone down the rabbit hole, I would say read The Hidden Cost of Money, the book we're discussing first,
Yeah.
given that I think it's important to understand the problem, and then really understand how Bitcoin actually solves many of the issues in terms of the solution. Um, But we initially actually wrote Beers for Bitcoin just as basically a book that people that wanted to deepen their understanding of Bitcoin, the origins of Bitcoin, why Bitcoin, how Bitcoin functions, what is blockchain mining, what is public-private key cryptography, how to interact with Bitcoin. This book is purely about Bitcoin. And so for those that have gone down that rabbit hole, now they want to learn more about Bitcoin, you can go dive into Beers for Bitcoin. And then you can also go and just take all of our content that we create is free and available on lookingglasseducation.com. And not only that, but if you're listening to this pod and a book is a little bit out of your price range, you're not able to afford a book, just reach out to me personally, whether it's on Twitter or on Looking Glass or my own personal website, sebbunny.com, and fire me an email and just say, hey, I'm not in the position to be able to buy the book, and I'll send you the ebook for free. Because I do believe in the free market, and I believe that price should not be a distraction from people being able to seek knowledge. And so I want to be able to support people in their journey.
And I can say I reached out to you cold, and you responded to me about this.
And I try to respond to, unless I accidentally miss it, I try to respond to every single person that responds to me.
Is there anything in this interview that you wish I had asked you and I didn't?
I wouldn't necessarily say so. I'd say that sometimes it's really easy to dive into like big topics. One of the ones that I do like to talk about is how money impacts kind of the parent-child bond, how it impacts the individual. That point, to be honest, I dive way deeper into it. If you just, the Investors Podcast with Preston Pish, I talk about that quite a bit in there. And so rather than spending another 30 minutes rambling about parenting, I'd just urge maybe go check out that one. But in short, when our money loses value over time, we have to go out and work more. Parents have to go and work more. And so even in Canada, we've seen a doubling since 1970 in the departure of the gold standard. In the US, we've seen a doubling of dual earner households and a halving of single earner households. So it's become way harder for parents to get by, which means they're spending less time with their kids. And we're seeing rising rates of ADHD, rising rates of depression, anxiety, all of these things, which are effectively just coping mechanisms because kids are not having their emotional needs met. And so I think that one of the things, going back to money weaves its influence into every aspect of our lives, it weaves its influence into our relationships. It weaves its influence into parents' ability to be able to show up for their children in the way they want to be able to show up. And although I don't think it's the only factor, social media is a factor, pharmaceuticals are a factor, you name it, toxins in our environment are a factor. I think that it's a big factor that is impacting parents.
And that's chapter 5 in your book. And money's toll on our planet is chapter 8. You know, like you, as I said, you're addressing a lot of like things that hit home, if you will. You know, like they really like impact our everyday lives, and we're not just talking about like an abstract, you know, peer-to-peer electronic cash system.
Absolutely. And that's where, to be honest, I just try to, when it comes to telling stories, when it comes to being able to supporting people in their own journey, it needs to be able to resonate with them. If we're just talking about Bitcoin in this kind of theoretical, technical manner, it's not going to relate to people. And so that's where I think it's, rather than talking about Bitcoin and its technicality, we need to talk about money and how money is impacting us as individuals, because that's what really matters.
All right. Thanks very much to my guest, Seb Bunney. This has been Proof of Pod, episode 6. We will see you next time.
Thanks a lot, David. I really appreciate you having on, and looking forward to kind of seeing more of your content.